Okay, so welcome back, everybody, for the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. I was mentioned to some of the listeners that actually every time I sit there, they kind of see me, not seeing the guest, so we just simply switch.
All right.
Now everybody can see your gestures and everything because,
okay.
basically what I do is just sitting there and doing nothing and pretend I'm listening, right?
All
So, yeah. So today we have Dr. Ryan McKelley, the second time on our podcast from the Department of Psychology. And today's topic is actually masculinity, which is something we talk about right after the last podcast, and I say, okay, I'm definitely interested in doing this.
Yeah.
So, thanks for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure. I had a blast the first time, so I'm glad to be back.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit why do you want to study this, or why you become interested in this?
Well, that's possibly a long answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
I should back up. Psychology it was like a second career for me. I went into management, tech consulting and stuff after undergrad.
What about masculinity?
Well, that's what I'll get to. So when I went to graduate school, I wasn't thinking about masculinity. I was thinking I'll get this doctorate in counseling, I'll get licensed, then I'll go back out and do executive coaching, or I'll go out and work in organizations with CEOs and that. So I was going to go from consulting back into consulting with a degree. But something interesting happened. So my dissertation idea. So when I was in management consulting, I used to hear male executives or partners at the firm talk about like, oh, I'm working on that with my coach, right? So this language of coaching was kind of already there in that field of consulting. I don't remember ever hearing a female colleague say, I'm working on it with my coach, or maybe talking about anger management. I might hear them say, oh yeah, I'm working on that with my therapist, but I never heard a male colleague mention being in therapy. So I already had an idea for my dissertation before I even went to graduate school. And the question was, what is this coaching thing, and why does this seem to be something that men are okay talking about, but they're not talking about therapy? And so when I went to graduate school, I had already planned on researching coaching and the difference between this model of helping people and this executive coaching thing versus traditional counseling or therapy. Because at the same time, I had worked with a coach at IBM. She was a former instructor of mine at undergrad. And I said, what's coaching? She's like, why don't you do 6 sessions with me? And so while I was changing careers, I had her as an executive coach. And I thought, wow, this feels a lot like counseling. Like, it doesn't feel radically different. So it was all these pieces coming together. And when I went to graduate school, my dissertation advisor says, I don't know anything about coaching, but I study men's issues. And he said, this looks like something that might fit under this broader area of like marketing mental health to men. Is there some service out there? Maybe coaching's a way to get more men, in some type of supportive, stuff.
For sure, yeah.
Without calling it therapy or counseling. So that's really was the initial thing, was just kind of an alignment of what I was curious about with my dissertation advisor's area, because he looked at marketing mental health to men's differential experience with depression, and those were kind of his big areas. So I started graduate school doing masculinity research before I even knew I wanted to do it. And then over time, I got really interested in it, and then started, I found there's a shortage of male therapists in graduate school, and so as
You mean therapists for males, or male therapists?
Male, therapists who are men. They're,
Interesting.
Well, the field of psychology flipped back in the 50s when it was a lab science. It was about 74 to 85% male during the era of behaviorism. But over the years, as the field has diversified, and after the cognitive revolution, multicultural revolution, we're looking much more broadly about human behavior. The gender ratio has flipped. So now undergraduate students and those going into clinical helping professions are about 75 to 85% female. So then there aren't a lot of male therapists relative to 50, 60 years ago. So anyway, that's all like the professional side, but there was a personal side to it as well. So I grew up in a house where I feel like my parents were pretty egalitarian. I mean, there's some traditional gender roles about who worked and who did what tasks, but my brother and I were taught all tasks. So whether it was mowing the lawn, changing oil in the car, sewing, baking, like we learned all that stuff. And so I always thought gender roles were pretty flexible. Although my sister never had to do any of the yard work, but learned all the other stuff. So I think I was always curious about gender, or gender roles at least, and I also was in some ways non-traditional. I liked playing sports. I had a couple different sports I did, but I never liked watching them. And so I grew up in a world where guys often would talk about sports, whether it's they're watching college baseball or basketball or NBA. Like, that was an easy way for guys to connect, and that was just never a language I spoke. And so I would either sit in silence in those, or I'd know enough. I'd learn enough that I could kind of throw a comment in and kind of disguise myself as knowing what I was talking about, but I really wasn't interested in it. So that was another one where I thought, like, what is it about this sports thing that men will really easily kind of get around and talk, but then they're maybe not having other conversations about other topics or something like that. So for me, it was always just kind of wondering, like, what is this gender role stuff? Why aren't we more flexible? And I don't think I felt comfortable being like fully restricted, and yet I witnessed that. I would see some of that restriction going on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, speaking of that, so can you somehow give us a vague definition of masculinity? Because when I think about it, I think about sports, I think about leadership, aggression, toxic masculinities, all the stuff, and also competitions. Is it a psychological trait? Is it a social image? Is it a symbol? What is it?
Yes. Yes to all those things. You asked me for a vague definition. I'll give you, maybe I'll start the definition with extremes. If you take a evolutionary biology or psychology approach where you're looking at kind of determinism, right, and like biological. So what is it about being biologically male that is unique to biological males compared to biological reproductive females? So I think some people define masculinity as that stuff, like whatever it is that's unique to males of a species, right, might be described as masculine. But then there's a different perspective called social construction, which is more about what are all the attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, what are some of the ways we express and experience gender, and how we associate it representing maleness or femaleness. And so so there's some correlation between how I show up biologically, and then a set of attitudes, behaviors, beliefs that we call masculinity when it's a male body doing these things, and maybe doing more of them on average than with female bodies. And for a long time, gender was seen as a unidimensional construct. You were either masculine or feminine. That's an old model that not too many people adhere to anymore, that is far more complicated than that. As humans, we are all of those things, and some of us might exhibit behaviors down on this end and others here, but these things change over time, so they're malleable. So when you ask me, like, what's masculinity, or how would you define it, it changes across culture, actually within culture too, right? Mm-hmm. So even within a culture, it's going to vary. It may vary by age. It may vary by racial and ethnic identity. It may vary by region. From country to country, it's different, and across time, it's different. So these things, there's some. It's not a. I don't describe it as a trait necessarily. It's.
Can we measure it?
Pardon?
Can we measure it? Like a trait?
We think we can,
like
but
0 to 1 scale or -1 to 1 scale.
I'll say no to that. Like, we've been trying to measure it, and over time, our ability to measure it shifts, and what.
As the definition shifts.
As the definition shifts, but then also as the culture shifts. So scales that were developed back in the 1950s don't show the same reliability and validity in any of the psychometric properties as they show today. And so it's like, well, have we changed? Has our masculinity changed, or gender roles changed? And the answer is, well, yeah, they have. And so therefore, people are responding to these same measures, and they're getting very different results. So then you come up with a new theory. And then you test that, and how well does this fit? And maybe that fits a particular group of males or men. But then you take, and so maybe it's a bunch of white, well-educated college males, which is where a lot of them were developed on. And then how's it look when I take the same measure and give it to this group of men who are at a different age, look different, then it's then the measurements don't work quite so well. And so I think it's hard. I've yet to find a measure that says this is masculinity or this is not. Now, I
Interesting.
do use them. I mean, I use measures of conformity to masculine norms. But you always have to understand, where did those norms come from? Where were they developed? Where was this instrument developed? And how are the studies that validated them? Where did those people come from? For now, many of those scales are on U.S. males, right? At higher ed institutions. But that's not the majority.
Country, there's definitely a different definition. Even from China, I know
Absolutely.
it's totally different. Yeah.
Right.
Is that a gender-neutral term, or actually, can you talk about masculinity in a woman, or it's purely a man thing for now?
Well, I think it depends on how you define it, right? If we're talking broadly just about gendered things, I do think many people will orient themselves along that continuum, saying, well, I identify this as male stuff or masculine stuff. And that's some of the research they do. They put a whole bunch of traits up, and they ask a whole bunch of people to identify those. Are these masculine, feminine, or neutral, or somewhere in between? And you can find pockets of behaviors or traits that people say, yeah, identify that's kind of a masculine thing, like aggression usually comes out of that. But that stuff varies too, and changes from place to place and time to time. So I don't know. You asked me for a vague definition, and
So it really depends.
it really depends, yeah. I don't know. But so yes, females or women or girls can behave in ways that a culture might identify as a masculine thing. But
Like
then,
the leaders in the women's sports team, right? Certainly we have something like that there.
yeah, in the United States, we've for a long time, right? But that's even shifting with Title IX. You know, so like as more women's sports, as more professional teams have come on, as more schools are required to offer sporting options for women, as women in sport has grown, our ideas about competitiveness, and I mean, those also shift too. Whereas if 70 years ago you only saw males doing sports, you would say, oh, sports are a male thing. But that's not the case anymore, because you see females doing sports too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, like I listed in my questions, so during the past 30, 50 years, I heard an opinion that a lot of people actually hear that opinion is just man has been becoming softer. You know, in terms. So is that a trend people discovered in research? Like, is everything softer? Is the world
So
changing?
well, I guess when you say softer, what are some of the things that you're thinking about?
People are just saying, like, you know, for example, I listened to your podcast and people are talking about back then, when you think of masculinity, you think about Rumble.
Yeah.
And now you think about Ryan Gosling is kind of like, you know,
Sure.
not super muscle and everything. It looks kind of like sometimes shy and everything, but people still think, okay, as time goes by, we probably don't go that extreme to our admiration of muscles, aggressions, like sports or like computation, those kind of things become more and more neutral and softer. Is that a trend? Or like another thing you can think about is actually a typical male student or male kid we see. Seems like, for some of them, just like they don't act as masculine as before when they were a kid, like during the 70s, 60s.
Right. Do I think it's changing? Yeah, I do think it's changing. and I can't say for the better or for the worse, other than I think it's just different. But it's always been that way. So when I teach about kind of the historical arc of masculinity and masculine presentation, even if we just look at like Europe, medieval Europe, when you look at the height of masculinity in with European kings, I mean, these are people who ruled over large, vast empires, controlled armies, had world at their fingertips. They were wearing dresses and fluffy skirts and high heel shoes and wigs, right? And so back then we would have associated that with extremely masculine. Now we don't generally, and then but things shift over time. And so in the United States, at least, when you would say, are we soft or are we different? A lot of the masculinity research, we're kind of in like still a post-World War II 1950s idea of kind of masculinity or masculine norms. I think those are still the things that kind of drive people's idea about what's masculine or not. And in the 80s, there was a big drive for muscularity, and that was for men in particular. That was like a big thing if you trace men's body image over the last decades. So getting really big.
Yeah.
That's changed though. Now it's, well, we want you to be muscly, but we want you to be really lean, not have a lot of body fat, and so we want you to look fit and ripped, but not all bulky and steroided out. And maybe we didn't care so much what you wore. Now you have to look kind of clean cut a little bit, but it used to be you could have hairy chest, coming out and long hair, and now
skin
it's
protection.
Right.
Yeah.
And now it's
sure.
like no, now some boys and men are shaving their bodies, but those all reflect. I think the question is, are those reflecting? Is it just reaction to media changing, or is media reflecting how masculinity is changing? The answer is they're doing it to each other. As we've objectified the male body, we've objectified the female body for thousands of years, but we're now starting to do very similar things to male bodies in advertising and stuff. And as you've seen male bodies objectified, you're seeing different influences on men and boys about their bodies and body image. And perhaps some of that change, that softness, is them reacting to change in style.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to think about those things as important because I think they're interesting to think about. But they're still like external expressions of gender, right? Like what I wear is just something you see on the outside.
What about the behaviors?
That's the thing that I'm like more interested in is masculinity changing from the inside. So if we associate, let's say if we associate masculinity like 1950s masculinity, like in the United States, rugged individualist, I make my own path, I make my own success, I'm a leader, I'm self-reliant, I don't ask for others for help. Are we different than that now? I don't know. I think that's still there, right? It's still a norm. It's still something we use to describe masculinity. But I think we're expanding other ways for men to show up in their worlds. So I'll narrow it down even more specifically. Let's look at fatherhood. I know you and I were talking about that before. The stereotype of the 1950s working man, right? He was gone all day long, and let's say he is married, has children. He's gone all day long, comes home, has dinner prepared, has a pipe or whatever, a drink. Maybe sees the children at a distance, but maybe not expected to be doing a lot of those caring things, and then goes to bed and it repeats. There are a whole broad range of ways that men are parents nowadays that weren't as visible back then. So whether it's single fathers or gay fathers, or just stay-at-home fathers, or men who just want to be more involved as a parent in their children's lives. I think in that way that their masculinity has changed. Or you've got like in a workplace. So if you've got newer generations of workers saying, no, it's a paternal leave is important to me, or family leave. I want to be able to take 4 weeks home with the birth of my child. That wasn't a thing.
People
50,
will laugh
60
at you.
years ago, right? And even when they're available, still men aren't always taking them. So it's just because they're available doesn't mean men feel like they can take them. But there's certainly a lot more that are asking for it, and they're saying that these are important values. So, to me, that would be a sign that masculine norms are changing. In that case, very specifically around fatherhood and/or intersection with work or work identity.
What about responsibilities? Taking responsibilities, taking risk, and sometimes support the family. Because I don't know, I just recently have seen too many single moms.
Yeah.
I just saying okay, these kids, basically they got you pregnant when they're 18, 20 or something, and I kind of feel like, this is basically a childish thing.
Mm-hmm.
I wish you could grow up as a man to take responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So is that
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I've thought about are men more or less responsible now than they used to be?
Or finding excuses for not success or not working, or
I don't know.
Yeah, for me, if I think from China, right, a lot of people, not a considerable amount of people, or in Japan, it's just they refuse to work. They just say I just don't want to grow up. Mm-hmm. If I need to support a family, fine. I just won't get married. Mm-hmm. I won't find a girlfriend. I won't I just live in the basement of my parents' house. Mm-hmm. It seems like that thing is a trend. I don't know how big of a percentage is going to go there, but it seems like those kind of things have become more and more normal nowadays. Mm-hmm. I just don't know if that's related to masculinity.
Well, so Michael Kimmel is a sociologist that studies some of this stuff, and he wrote the book Guyland, where the perilous world of boys when they become men. I know some sociologists have looked at that and tried to understand, adolescence has become extended. So if we go back 60 years ago, what were your options as a male in the United States, at least, if you're graduating high school? Well, many might go into the service. Some will go into vocation. A small percentage might go into college. and many married at a much younger age. So the age at which people partner and marry is much later now than it was back then. And so, are they now in this kind of extended period of adolescence where back then you had markers of responsibility? Like if you were enlisted, right? I mean, you were pretty responsible there. If you were married and already had a child or were working, you were a breadwinner back then, or you were. So I think as we delay those things, maybe some of those other behaviors aren't changing. People are still having sex, and the consequences of those are much different now than they were back then. If there's a support network in place, if they have a place to go live, if it's in a parent's basement, I guess that's the question: is has our social structure changed in a way that is more supportive of an extended adolescence?
Yeah.
Right.
Or just putting less pressure on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And we can't look at masculinity in isolation either. So if we look at opportunities for girls and women as a result of the women's movement here in the U.S., part of the goal for that, or the outcomes, is to expand opportunities for women's roles. Some people have argued we haven't done a very good job of doing that for boys and men. So while women have increased opportunities, at least now it doesn't always get reflected that way in practice. But if they're being encouraged that you too can go into the sciences, and you too can do X, Y, or Z, you too can work, and I don't think that we've seen as much work for boys saying, yeah, you too can, as a male, be a kindergarten teacher, or you could be in a caring profession, or the economy's changed, right? There's a lot more service-oriented positions than there were back then too, and so I don't know if we've done enough to tell boys and men that there's other ways to take responsibility and show up, and be a contributor to society outside of those very clearly defined ones from decades ago. So that is one concern I have.
So basically, if you open up one direction, you should also open up the other direction.
Yeah.
And if you just don't close the direction from like male, and then say, hey, number one, you cannot still be nurse, or you will be judged if you become a nurse or anything. But meanwhile, you kind of lose on the masculinity requirement. Then the softer kids just figure like, I actually would love to be a nurse or something, but now the door is closed. Yeah. So they don't live to the full of their life.
Yeah. And so even I want to go back to even that language of softer, and even maybe get a little bit more specific. I think we have sometimes equated that as less than or less desirable, right? Yeah. We even do it when we talk about skills for college students, like, oh, those are soft skills versus these technical ones. I think the problem with that, though, is it doesn't put any of that stuff in context. And so let's use emotional restriction, right, and like stoicism. There's certainly, and that's been associated with masculinity for a long time, so that males generally, as they get older, have a less, more restrictive range of emotions that they're kind of allowed to have, without being judged. Anger is one that they do, but it's not okay socially necessarily for a boy or man to cry, right, or show some of these vulnerable emotional expression. And there might be environments where that isn't helpful for them, right? So professions where that would be a detriment if they showed up. Let's say somebody's a first responder, or if they're in law enforcement. You wouldn't want a police officer in a tense moment bringing in a tear, right? However, if there's an occupation over here that benefits from vulnerability and somebody's ability to know their own emotions and connect with others and provide care and support, we should be teaching people how to do that, or supporting them in that, so they can be successful in that role. And so if we're not providing those opportunities, we're not honoring boys and men that have that as the way they're kind of maybe the natural way they show up, and we don't give them opportunities to show it, I don't know, they could get stuck in a basement.
So they're less prepared, basically.
Right.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, according to what you said, I admit that probably softer is not a great word to use. It's more about masculinity has changed. They are certainly softer than the standard from 1950s, but as we said, 1950s, nobody says that's the golden standard or anything.
Right.
So yeah, as long as your social construction changed with this, the definition changed with this, but also your social role, your social opportunity changed with this, then it's actually pretty smooth.
You got it. Well, yeah, I wish.
Well, it will be.
It could be smoother.
Smooth.
Yeah, I think because that's I appreciate you saying that, because it made me think sometimes we ask about, is masculinity changing? Maybe the question to ask is our social context and environment changing?
It's more about gender
yes.
roles than, yeah.
And how well do these constructs fit this new world? I mean, we are just in a completely different. We're not in the manufacturing age like we were. I mean, there's still people who do that, but automation has shifted some of that stuff. The types of jobs that are available here, I mean, there's so much more diversity and variety in them, and some of the skills that are required to be successful in them. And so, if that construct from 60 years ago isn't working in this environment, we either need to change the construct or teach people how to be successful in this new social world, or they'll be left behind. Or what we're seeing now, you've got increased, men are at greater risk for completing suicides in many countries. They die anywhere from 5 to 15 years earlier than women on average. And so there are real effects. We've got to sort out why are these things happening at such different levels.
Interesting, yeah. I from a layman's point of view, like I heard this kind of conversation all the time, just like women, you have rights and people create opportunities and advocate for those kind of things for a long, long time. And finally we feel like, okay, finally, the opportunity is getting more and more equal. But then it's kind of squeezed the space of the man, unless you actually do this roughly the same thing. And then basically we kind of blur the differences between genders to make it more egalitarian point of view. That would be nice, but it kind of, I feel like it's for a lot of people, it feels like it's one directional.
Yeah.
But so what do you think about the feminine, movement about, before women was probably like here in terms of opportunities, rights and everything. But now with all these years of effort, everywhere you are constantly reminded of that, women's, they are equally capable, if not more capable. They should have be given those kind of opportunities. Do you kind of feel like, where is the thing going? If this is male, this is female, are they roughly equal now, or actually it's time for us to actually rethink? Maybe male we should actually shift our attentions or resource a little bit to the male now, or actually it's still like that. It's just less extreme than before.
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is not my quote, but. Yeah, I remember somebody years ago had said the only problem with the women's movement is there hasn't been an equal one for men to meet them halfway.
Yeah.
And so what I'm about to say, I'm going to give a caveat because it's a little bit more of I don't know, it's a pessimistic view, which I don't necessarily hold, but a question we should ask ourselves, I think is important to ask, is some of the traits that we associate with masculinity. So let's say aggressiveness over assertiveness. Self-reliance, not asking for help or not needing help. So some of the things that we for a long time have kind of associated. Are we telling women if you do these things then you'll be successful in this world, right? So are we seeing an increase in masculine behaviors as a function of generating success for women? And if that's so, I don't know that that's the right answer because
work like a man.
Right. Well, because guess what? What else comes with that, right? If you're over-involved with work, if you're denying your emotional experience, you're also going to see some of the problems that we see that men experience from doing those things. So that's where I think it's hard to do this because, if this was the masculine ideal, if we're doing this, at what point are we not just lifting women up, but then pulling up all these other problems that men have experienced? So I'd rather think of it, can I guess it's a cliche, but more the expanding the pie thing instead of this either or, and if you're getting more, that means I'm getting less, because I think that's the threat response. When men feel threatened, we'll say, look at you, you've got all these rights and I'm losing them, and now I'm going to reestablish my power and dominance. That's not going to work for anybody. But if we're stuck in this either I have it or I don't, and you have it or I don't, that's not going to work. Is there some other way here that we all, again, I don't know what it graphically looks like, other than expanding the pie and expanding the possibilities.
Let's open up the boundary, huh?
Open up the boundaries. Yeah. Now, and then on the other end, so the other kind of the fantasy or extreme is, why do we even have gender? Couldn't we just have a genderless world where we don't say aggression is masculine, we just say it's human. We don't say compassion and caring is feminine, we just say it's human. I don't know that that's ever going to happen.
Or is it a good thing?
Or is it a good thing, right? It's just, but I still think it's an important question to ask is like, how can we give people as much flexibility as possible and adaptability as possible to meet the varying demands and changing social world so they can all be successful? Because when women experience more financial stability and health, everybody benefit. Like these things, everybody has the potential benefit from it. But if we always see it as a zero-sum game and it comes at some cost, then I don't think that works. For a number of reasons.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So back into that, if we kind of start to blur, let's take a imagination now, a genderless world, right? Yeah. What are the role models people like kids should look up to? Like before, when I grow up, I just of course look up to my father because I'm a male, and if I'm a female, probably I look up to my mother and see all those kind of things. Now you kind of blur that.
Yeah. I don't know.
I find it difficult for myself to accept that. I understand the point, but I'm just saying, like, it's hard for me to imagine a world like that because, sometimes you get this kind of doctrine is almost like a man should do this and that, and look at your father, he's supporting the family and everything. When I grow up, I feel that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You actually take your responsibility, you're put in that position with your gender, and you just need to be successful. There's a lot of responsibilities on you. It's a pressure. Yeah. It's also motivations.
Yeah.
But now if you tell me like, it's fine if you do that, and it's fine if you do that, and it's fine, sure. I may become like lost. It's just like, okay, everything is fine.
Sure.
So since when, from where, or towards which goal, should I restrain myself? Should I, skill myself, polish myself, steel myself to actually become the role figure I want to be?
Well, I'll give you like just a very specific finding that came out of a study that I did with a couple colleagues at University of Texas at Austin on stay-at-home fathers. And we ended up titling it, "I'm Just Providing for My Family." So, and this is a very specific example of it, but many of these guys in our study, so we did some focus group, interviews, qualitative stuff, but then we did a nationwide one. We look at well-being, relationship satisfaction, confidence in their skills for different parenting tasks, from providing care, but also providing autonomy and supporting kids' development, all these types of things. In many of these cases, most of the time, these were married men whose partner had a career that made more than they did. Mm-hmm. And so it came down to looking at costs of childcare and doing the math and saying, well, just because I was raised male and to be the breadwinner and be the provider, that's not going to work financially. That wouldn't make any sense. We're going to lose money if you stay home as the mother and I go to work. So therefore, by default, I'm going to be the one that ends up working. These men, a lot of them, kind of reconceptualize what providing for the family means. And so providing certainly can mean financially. Right, like I bring home the paycheck and I'm going to cover expenses and food and all that, roof over your head. But you can also provide by providing childcare, nurturance, watching the kid at home, reading, teaching them how to read, like doing all the things that we, for a long time we associate with motherhood. Why do those have to be gendered in the sense that couldn't one of those kids hypothetically then grow up and say, my mom was this great, powerful financial earner and did really great in this field, and my dad in this case was really, a lot of fun and was there for me when I, got picked on in school and helped me with my homework. Like, why does it have to be what it used to be, like what we valued as masculine or feminine as far as roles go? Mm-hmm. They had a lot of pride in what they were doing. They felt a lot of pride in providing those different roles. Now, some struggled in learning to because they didn't grow up that way. They didn't grow up thinking they were going to be that. Mm-hmm. But they're all skills that they learned.
I understand that I would say for now, probably for a minority of people, like a male, who basically don't like the other way, but then they say, hey, I want to be a mother. I want to take the mother's role and provide for my family in this way. That's fine. But I'm still thinking, like, are males or females born with some trait? It's just like masculinity will make the majority of the men feel comfortable, like going compete, going sports and everything. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that they were forced to do that.
Yeah.
Right? If they are forced to do that, figure that. What if I don't like it just like you?
Mm-hmm.
And then given the opportunity, would be nice to be appreciated in another way, right? But for the majority, should we still advocate like what a successful man figure is, or should we just stop doing that?
Well, I don't think we should stop modeling what a good human is, right? Broadly,
human,
right? Yeah.
I'm just saying gender-wise.
I think we should provide. I think it'd be nice if we provided more opportunities for people to kind of sort that out themselves, and maybe try some of those roles on earlier, so they don't get pigeonholed too young. So I'm not saying like that it needs to go away, and I'm very clear about this because people will sometimes say, "Oh, you're trying to turn, you support the idea of like turning men into women, or like or taking away masculinity." Not at all. Like I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with masculinity, or right, unless it's causing harm to self or others. For me, that's where problems are with gender roles. If what I do causes harm to myself, if I'm engaging in behaviors that are physically harmful, or I'm causing harm to another human being, I think it's fair to say that's a problem, right? And I think that's what, when we say toxic masculinity, that's often what people are talking about. But if we're socializing boys to have this very narrow definition of here's what you can do to be a successful or ideal male, and it doesn't include all these other things, I just don't think that's fair. There might be some that do that quite well and succeed, and they're happy, and everybody else around them is happy, and that's great. But what about for the ones that don't, and they don't feel like they have any other way to show responsibility or achieve, unless it's in this very narrow domain?
Otherwise, you're a failure, basically, right? That's what it says. Yeah.
Yeah, and then how do people deal with failure? Some deal with it through numbing, through substance use. Some will isolate themselves socially. Some will act out, and others. So if we're putting people in that situation, I don't see how it's beneficial to us as a collective. And so I guess going back to your question, I think it's just more about presenting more options.
So multiple figures you can look after.
Yeah.
Here's a role model for masculinity, like masculine dad. Here's a dad who is actually going to do this. Here's a dad who is going to do that. And just have more stories, have more movies made to basically let people know there are multiple options.
Yeah. And I think that is happening. I mean, even if you look at people who are critical media analysts and look at gender in the media, it's like the way there's still all the same stereotypical ways that gender, but then there's also, it has expanded. I mean, you're seeing more representations. What was I going to tell you? Yeah, well, it's gone.
Okay. Yeah. But then I just want to still push on that idea a little bit. Yeah. That is, when I was listening to something Jordan Peterson was trying to say, is just the reason he became so popular. It's almost because that he gave those male opportunity to take responsibilities, which nobody have forced them or pushed them to take before. So, do you think actually, how to say, calling for responsibility, calling for something you don't have, is going to make you better?
If you provide the supports in the skill development to fill that gap. So I say that because I'm thinking about like in clinical terms. Yeah. For when I think about what supports people in positive change, right? Like, actually, this doesn't even be clinical. I mean, think about your own. Like, think about education. Like, we learn when there's when we're motivated, when there's a little gap between where we are now and where we want to be. But for that to happen, I need to have some structural support in place. I can't go from arithmetic to calculus, right? Even though I may want to get there, we have this whole developmental stretch, like, to get people there. And I think, so if we say men need to show up and be responsible, right? And for that to be motivating for men and to be helpful for men, we also then have to give them opportunities to practice that. And this is, I'll go back to what I said before. Responsibility can be defined in any number of ways. I think if it's too narrow, if it says you can only show responsibility by doing X, Y, or Z because that's what men do, I don't think you're going to get a full, healthy approach to it. because you're saying, I need to be here, I'm here now, and you're not offering me any pathway to get there. When people feel threatened like that, I mean, I think a lot of people will experience that threat and they'll go into defense mode, and whether it's blaming and saying, I don't have this because you, or you haven't given the opportunity, or you've taken this from me, and it becomes that zero-sum kind of reactive approach to it. I've got no problem with saying men need to take more responsibility, but you don't get to pick and choose what that is, though. So I'll give you an example. So if we say, men, you need to show up and you need to be responsible, that also may include responsibility for your health. And so that may mean you need to go get screened, get your prostate cancer screening, get testicular cancer screening. Some of the stuff that men don't do at high, have not done at high levels for a long time. You might need to watch what you eat. You might need to drink less. That's also being responsible. But some of those traits of not seeking help and kind of, being overly concerned with risk-taking, that's antithetical to showing up and being responsible. But I don't think there's anything gendered about taking care of your health or taking more calculated risks or a little less harmful risks.
So that's, for me, almost look like the stereotype for masculinity, which is the toxic side of the masculinity, and certainly we want to remove that. What about the good ones, like the aggression, for example? Do you feel like, I don't know, are we losing aggression in the younger generation?
I don't know. I certainly haven't seen evidence of it.
I mean, I just need to admit, I have been in the United States since 2008. I never seen a single fist fight.
Oh.
But I never go to the bar, so maybe it's just me.
Maybe that's why.
I'm trying to feel
we call that
really peaceful.
It's like, that's what we call selection bias. You're hanging out here on a university campus, and I've seen fist fights. I've been at a party when a gun's been pulled.
Okay, I guess.
I don't know. It's hard to answer that question because of the rise of social media and access to information. So even the aggression question is, do we have the same levels of it, but now it's getting captured on a smartphone and then, broadcast to millions of people, or maybe we have less of it, but this incident is getting broadcast to millions of people, and so then we're overestimating the actual base rate of what's going on. We know we have a problem with, multiple mass shootings, 3 or more victims. I mean, that is on the rise. So I don't know. I guess it just depends on how aggression shows up. But aggression, even when I talk about aggression isn't masculine or not. It is gendered in the way it gets expressed in cultures. Mm-hmm. And so the early studies on aggression showed pretty significant gender differences in rates of aggression. But when they kind of expanded that construct to include relational aggression, gossiping, rumor spreading, social exclusion, which in the United States, traditional gender roles, those would have been defined as ways that women are more likely to show aggressive than kind of physical fistfight stuff.
Yep.
That gap in aggression actually decreased when you.
There are research showing that.
Yeah, when you broaden the meaning of aggression. So it's just to say that as humans we can be aggressive in any number of ways. The question is, do we do gendered aggression? And I think we do, but that also means that it doesn't have to show up that way all the time. And can you channel whatever that is into some other productive pursuit or some other way? We could do a whole sidebar on anger and its expression and how it's socialized. Maybe we'll get there. I don't know, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't see evidence of less aggression.
Uh-huh.
But some others have said if you like anthropologists, if you've looked at human societal-wide violence over, 10 or maybe thousands of years, they say as a whole, globally, we actually have probably a much more peaceful existence than we did 1,000 years ago.
Makes sense. Yeah, aggression is probably not such a valuable trait compared to in the ancient times, right?
Right.
Where war become like almost your day job.
Yeah.
Once in a while. Interesting.
But that's easy for me to say sitting here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, because I'm not in a high conflict zone, right? And so my world, this conversation would be very different if you plot me into a high violent neighborhood or in a country that's engaged in civil war, right? And so that's the other thing is this stuff. certainly there are pockets of it where it's out of control and it's horrible and it's causing all kinds of problems. I'm just not in one right here.
Yeah. So yeah, because this kind of conversation kind of reminded me, because when I was back in, I was thinking about my country, right? Before I came here, I talked with my friends and everything. They were talking about how bad the young generation is. Like, the responsibility is gone. People don't work. They don't want to actually show up on time. They cannot afford this. They don't do that. But then it turns out they just sometimes, I agree with a lot of them. With what I see, but then I started remember, like, when my parents talked this exactly the same thing to me.
That's right. I know.
And that's the moment I figured out, okay, I was listen to some music and they say, wow, this is kind of crap, and now I listen to the young kids. What are you listening?
Right.
It's basically I couldn't take that. So sometimes it just got the illusion. It's just like we're so familiar with the old standard,
yes,
including masculinity, right, and
yep.
all the gender roles and everything. And give me 20 years and everything. I look at all the young kids, just like, you guys are basically worthless.
Right.
And then you start to think about yourself. Maybe they're not actually softer or anything. It's just they're redefining the whole thing.
Maybe.
And according to your observation, actually, there's nothing to worry about, right? It's more about basically make you free, make each individual free.
That's, I think, a great summary of it. And so I'll give you a metaphor that I use. If I do like a presentation on this, I don't know how familiar you are with Swiss Army knives, but. Yep. Yeah, and I actually meant to. I don't have my. I meant to actually.
I have a lot of them, and I got one actually still sitting in Atlanta, the airport. I didn't know.
I know. I've lost a couple over the years. So the classic. So the classic Swiss Army knife, the Victorinox, is that small one that just has, I think, scissors, knife, toothpick, file, and tweezers. So when I talk about gender roles, I say, imagine that's masculinity right now as you know it. Like, that's the world you've grown up with. And whatever, we can say the nail file represents emotional restriction. And so right now, you've been in situations where emotional restriction, you pull out that nail file and you use it, and it's worked for you. Maybe it's prevented you from crying when you were getting hazed in a locker room, and so that helped maybe reduce how much more you were going to get picked on or something. So you're like, oh, this tool's pretty good, right? Like, I've used it a couple times, I held back my tears, and everything worked out well. Now, the problem with this is, now let's take 25 years from now, you're in a romantic relationship or marriage or whatever, where humans need to understand each other's emotions and provide some emotional support. If all you have is that nail file, and you're like, not going to go there, can't think about that, not going to talk about it, that's probably going to cause problems in your relationship. And we do know this from research. Men that score higher on those scales of measuring emotional restriction tend to report less satisfaction in their romantic relationships. They often will also report less satisfaction in the role of parenting. I mean, think about, as a parent, how many times it requires an emotional understanding to help meet somebody. So that's masculinity, a very restricted version of masculinity. When I talk about how to change, it doesn't mean get rid of the nail file. It doesn't say throw all those things out and come up with an entirely new configuration. If you look at the Swiss Champ, right, that big one that's about like 4 inches thick, there's still a nail file on there. But there's also a fish saw. I mean, there's all kinds of magnifying glass. It's just loaded. That's how I would like to see us do gender, which is add a bunch of other options. Expand your default options from this, like, 5 sets of behaviors.
And probably a lot of people are still going to go with the default, which is fine.
That's fine. There might be situations, actually, I'll scratch that. There will be situations where that default is the right, maybe most appropriate for you and the social setting. But now you've got a bunch of other options, so you don't have to do the default. Maybe you try the default and it doesn't work, and now I'm going to try this other thing. That's how I would like to see masculinity. I'd like to see it expand, be far more inclusive, and then as a result provide people with healthier ways of showing up in the world, either for themselves or for others in their life.
Same thing with feminines, probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I do. Same thing. Well, yeah. I guess you take that same metaphor.
Yeah.
Let's look at assertiveness. Like, it didn't used to be they taught assertiveness training for girls and women. But now it's like, here, learn these skills that will come in handy in this particular occupational setting or something else. But you don't want to show up assertive or aggressive maybe in a romantic relationship. All right. You do want to be assertive, but maybe not aggressive. So again, it does work both ways. I think it's expanding the options, giving you behavioral flexibility or adaptability.
And do you feel that is happening?
I do. I do think so.
So actually, in general, we're getting better, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I
think people put a way bigger tolerance compared to things back in 1970s.
Yeah,
and
I've
80s.
heard that from people. I mean, I've even heard from older people in my life, great aunts and uncles, grandparents, saying, "Oh yeah, I never could have done this. Like I never could have said this, and now people are doing it." And I guess because much of my research was on fatherhood, that's a lot of those examples come into my head. I heard a lot of guys say, "I always wished I could have done that. Right? I wished I could have taken time off and spent, but I couldn't, or I didn't feel like I could, or I'd be judged." And so I do hear a lot of those wishes. Like I wish I had an option like you do. My dad even said that. My dad was a great athlete, football player, wrestler, pole vaulter. He in many ways very masculine. And yet as we got older, like there were times we said, "Yeah, I wish I could have done some of the things. I wish I had some of the opportunities that you all had, or I wish I would have liked to do this that I didn't have available back then in the 50s." So I hear that. I think there's some wishfulness, and so that to me is a sign that people are observing things to be different and having more opportunity.
So putting yourself in a cage, basically you are losing all the fun of the other
think
side.
so.
Yeah,
I think
interesting.
so.
So let's go back to parenting.
Yeah.
So for nowadays, what do you think? If I have a boy.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to raise your boy, what would be a nice approach to somehow show him the responsibility and everything? It's like the classic, we would say non-toxic masculinity things.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, respect him enough to give him all these opportunities, so he feel he didn't wish something happened. Actually, he did have nothing happen.
Yeah. I think you just answered your question. I think that last piece. Let me give you one very specific example that I talk about a lot when I talk about communication. This is not my research. This is some communication scholars sort this out. This will be a very specific example. Then I'll go maybe back to what you asked. Somebody had done a study of how parents respond to emotional pain of their children. And so I'll just give you an example of what the scenario might be. So let's say a boy, in this case, we'll talk about boys and girls, although, it's certainly not restricted to those two labels. But let's say we have a girl that gets picked on in the playground at school. She comes home, and the types of questions historically or traditionally are asked of little girls are, how did you feel, or oh, you must have been right. So there's a lot of emotion-focused questions. Twin brother gets picked on at school, comes home. Historically or traditionally, a lot of the questions are, what did you do? What did he do? What happened next?
How bad did he hurt?
Right. Did you fight back? And they found that parents that respond to their daughter, so parents, again, on average, historically, respond to their daughter's pain by exploring emotions, and they explore their son's pain by looking at problem solving. And over time, if you repeat that hundreds and thousands of times, you now have very gendered approaches to conflict. And you've got daughters who were encouraged to explore their emotions, how it made them feel. And you've got boys who are told, we're not going to deal with the emotional stuff. Let's solve this problem. Let's figure out what to do. Neither one of those is good or bad, but extremes of either without the other doesn't make you a good problem solver or good in human relationships. So back to your original question, if I'm parenting children, and that happened, I would say give them both, right? Give them space and time to explore the feelings that how that felt when it happened, and explore what are we going to do next time, or how can we prevent this, or what can we do? Here are some 3 options. I think looking at the ways that we show up differently for boys or girls, what we're providing for them or withholding from them, and trying to level the playing field a little bit. There's been a lot of research on just affection, physical affection. That and again, I'm when I say it, I'm speaking of the research I know. Like in the U.S. culture, historically, infant boys are like hugged and cuddled a little less on average than infant girls. And if you run that over the lifespan, and you start to see parents pulling away physically from their children around school age, like 6 or 7. Well, what happens when they were having, boys are having a little less, touch, hugging, all that stuff helps regulate. That's how bodies learn to self-regulate. I mean, it's built in the nervous system and limbic response in the brain. If they're deprived of that, maybe run that many years, they aren't aware of their emotion. They don't know how to get emotional needs met. They may seek to get them met in other ways, right? Through sexual activity or through substance or avoidance or whatever it might be. And so that's a very specific one. It's like, as a parent, it's like, well, make sure that you do give some space to stay physically connected to your son, just like you might, or just like people might do for their daughters. Like, not to pull away. That often happens in that way. I think just giving them more behavioral flexibility. And
so instead of treating them as a girl or as a boy, treat them as human.
As human, yeah. And it's, I mean, I know that, on the extreme end, there's people that attempt to do genderless parenting, and often, I don't know if you've heard in interviews.
Genderless parenting in regarding to boy or girl, or in regarding to father and mother?
To the child.
To the child.
And saying we're not going to even tell them what gender we think they are. We're not going to use pronouns. We're not going to use, the stereotypical color schemes. We're going to do, gender-neutral toys. And that meant and I've listened to interviews of them early on, and then 6 years later, it's like they can't do it. You don't have control of that.
They got it either way, yeah.
Right. I mean, society the need to make gender binary culturally is so strong that it's very difficult to control all these environments. But that doesn't mean to throw away some of those approaches. I mean, I guess you could just pick any number of behaviors or attitudes we associate as being more one gender than another, and I would just say, just pause and think about what are the consequences if I only approach my son with this. What are the costs and what are the benefits? Because I sometimes think we forget about the cost. So with boys, if there are absolute benefits socially to say, yeah, at some point, it's okay if you cry here at home, but if that happens in the classroom, you might get teased, right? Taken to an extreme, that's the same boy that over time will learn that, they may learn there's nowhere I can go to be myself emotionally, and so I'm just going to hold it all in, and that doesn't work out well for anybody. It either comes out as depression, anxiety, and sometimes
I think
violence to others.
A lot of that explains the depression and the suicide.
Absolutely. So that's where I'd say, like, give all children safe spaces at home to tolerate some of this stuff and explore some of this stuff, and support and model it. That's probably the most important part. And I'm going to be honest with you. I study this stuff. I do struggle with it. Like, I was raised, I biological male. I associate as, in some ways quite masculine. Allowing myself to be emotionally vulnerable in the form of crying in front of my children is not easy.
What about on a podcast?
I could probably get there. Well, the funny thing is, I can do it. I mean, I'm actually more fine now than I probably used to be doing it publicly. Like, I gave an address at the American Psychological Association. I was talking about my dad and growing up, and it was fine for me in that context to show some emotion. But the irony is, I have a hard time doing it around my girls, which is kind of ironic. It'll be after the fact. I'm like, oh my gosh, that quick reaction was, I can't let them see me this way. Like, what are they going to think? And my wife after the fact will be like, they'll just think that dads have feelings too. Like, the world's not even crashing down.
Yeah.
But that's, that was the world I grew up in. And so even though I know I'm capable of doing it in certain contexts, it'd be different if in 40-something years I'd never shed a tear. But there's just, I guess I'm being vulnerable and self-disclosing that I know how hard it is. And so if you can give people opportunities earlier, give them more behavioral adaptability and flexibility, it won't be such a struggle. And then if you get let's say your son is struggling with something, right, in middle school or high school, as long as he's learned that, there is a place I can go and be myself, and if that's home, that's great. That I think's the important part.
That's actually what home is for, right?
Yeah, I would hope, ideally, right?
That's ideally that's actually
scenario.
why you need a home, right? It's just
Right.
somewhere which belongs to yourself, and when you come back, no matter how stupid
Right.
you were outside, you came back, you can actually say the truth, and
Yeah.
don't being worried to be judged,
Yeah.
and they will say, well, even though you did the stupid thing, you're still accepted here.
Yeah,
You can still be yourself. So stop playing the role that society wants you to play as a father,
Mhm.
but have human feelings too, and it's okay to express them, especially with the people who are closest to you.
Yeah.
Probably similar thing to marriage too, which
Yeah.
I don't see a lot actually in marriage. That's why I become interested in observing some of my friends' marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Just taking a look and try to start actually, through all the case studies in
Yeah.
my micro mind and just say why this worked out, why it's not working out, and try to find out what's the most healthy way of conducting a marriage. I kind of
Mhm.
feel like it's actually the same as the home. It's just like you need to feel
Mhm.
safe, right?
Yeah.
Feel
Yeah.
safe, yeah, and.
So I'll give you one of the most, one of the things I find so devastating about interpersonal violence or domestic violence. So, I've got colleagues that research this, and some specialize in it clinically, and I learned this, actually it's been written about in a couple different places. If you just look, so let's look at heterosexual couples violence, because most of the research has been in that population. One of the precursors to men's violence against their female partner is shame. That maybe they're in an argument. Maybe the partner says, you're worthless, you can't make any money, you can't pay any bills, like you're a worthless partner, husband, boyfriend, whatever, you're a failure of a man. Like, shame is a precursor to a lot of men's violence, right? Not even just in a relationship, but look at gang, and so if we don't teach men, boys and men, how to manage shame, or how to sit with and deal with and accept it, and we only say, you can't feel this, and we're not going to let you feel, sad. We're not going to let you feel disappointed, embarrassed, or you're going to answer that shame. If I socialize you to solve problems through violence, then you're putting people at risk. So that's where I think, the more we can teach, if you can create places for boys to learn to sit with shame and deal with it in more functional and adaptive ways, I think we will reduce interpersonal violence, because then I don't need to reestablish masculinity through that means. I can be honest with how I'm feeling right now. When you said I'm worthless, that hurt, and I have a lot of shame about. I wish I made more money. Right? When I think about being a man, it's about making money. And if people don't have space to challenge some of that stuff and learn other ways to deal with it, it's very quick that that reaction, a violent, aggressive reaction happens.
Before you bring nothing up, I didn't even think about there was another way to solve it. But once you bring it up, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's actually reasonable.
Mm-hmm. That's been my concern with traditional anger management. There's definitely benefit to it. So let's say you and I are in an argument, and then you get really heated, and you say, okay, and you're like, all right, I got to calm down, so I'm going to take a couple deep breaths. I think that's valuable, right? Anything that's going to get your nervous system back down to a place where we can actually communicate and prevent maybe you from going too far. So I think there's a place for managing anger, but that happens after it's already out there, right? And the problem with that is the risk is once it's out there, some people don't have a lot of control over it, and then it comes out in a whole bunch of terrible ways. Wouldn't we rather prevent the anger and work downstream? And so when I work with clients about it, I will always slow down and say, I get the anger. Like, let's look at the anger as a defensive reaction, right? Like, you were harmed in some way, and you felt like this is the way I need to defend myself. But I'd say, what did you feel right before, like the split second before you were angry? Many times, not all, but many times, it's shame, disappointment, embarrassment, all these things. If you can teach people how to manage and deal with that stuff, then you don't ever have to manage the anger, because it's not there. Anger's got an evolutionary history, right? That's adaptive. Mm-hmm. If in the example I usually use, if we were walking down the street and somebody threatens the safety and life of one of my family members, you bet I'm going to do whatever it takes. I will probably lose control, right? But that's been, female do that in the species too, like when we defend our young. So I'm not talking about like reactive survival anger and aggression that happens to preserve your life. We get angry in all sorts of situations that it's not a true threat like that. And so if we can give if we can name those situations for what they are, instead of a threat to my life in that moment, right? So if you call me a name at a bar, you're not threatening my life, right? Like that name's not going to do anything. But if I react in a way that I'm defending my life, that's not going to help anybody. I'd rather figure out how do I deal with the pain of whatever name you called me in a way that I don't have to default to anger. I don't know if that's a great example or not, but
that makes sense to me. Yeah, that's towards like the threat you have, or like just meaningless people looking for fight in the bar. You certainly can do better than just go there and just make the thing happen, right? But that thing just actually reminds me when you talk about the shame and when men start actually use violence towards their female partners. For me, it's almost like why is stubbornness or violence easier than just being honest? Like, wow. That's the moment you start to feel like humans are really stupid creatures, because if you just say you're feeling, the other one will be able to feel it, and I don't see anything this like. Yeah, I just feel like you can communicate so sincerely, just like I'm hurt. Yeah. I tried my best. Like if you could say that, that would be a more powerful line than just go with violence. But somehow, so many people just chose to go the other way, which way more harmful, do way more damage, but feels like easier.
Right. Oh yeah, it does feel easier.
And then you start to feel like, yeah, that's really something is missing, because clearly the other way is easier in terms of like damage, like whatever, right? Yeah.
Well, and I don't know. That gets back to I am not going to blame this on media. I'm just going to make the statement though. If we limit models, like if I don't ever see that solution to a problem, if I don't see a human being, particularly when I look up to, solve a problem in that way, where am I going to learn it? Like, if all I ever see is men solve problems by using violence, and really that still is the
solution. And it's
solution.
Justified.
Right.
Actually, if you do that, it's justified. Nobody's going to blame you. It's just like, your wife said that.
Right.
Well, she deserved.
Yeah.
Right.
So that kind of
that's what your friend is going to say.
Right. That kind of attitude, and it's all and we see it in depicted violence and aggression all over the place. Like, I love me some superhero movies, but I mean, violence is the solution to.
When you have superpower, yes, because you can basically crush the other guy's face.
That's right. And I think about like, again, a lot of this comes from doing therapy with men, so I recognize it's kind of a special situation, but a lot of them will say, I never saw my dad do that. I never. They don't necessarily see them solve problems in that way of just being honest in the moment and having that conversation. And it's not to say they weren't happening. Maybe they're happening after the kids went to bed, and who knows. But if they're not seeing it modeled in their own lives and the people they look up to, and they're only seeing problem solved, with aggression and all these other areas, I don't know. Somebody's like, how why are we surprised that this is our response, or that this is some people's response to that?
Interesting.
So that's where I go back to what you asked earlier about, I've got a son, what do I do?
Yeah.
Like, can you model healthy conflict with his mother, right? Like, I would argue that would be helpful to say how they just disagree with each other. And it's okay even if things get heat, right? Emotions, there's nothing wrong with that. I think part of the problem, too, is that...
They lived together for 50 years. Those kind of things has to happen.
Right.
By chance.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying... that we should everything should be like peaceful and like non-emotional. That's not realistic. I think the opposite occurs. Sometimes I'll hear people talk about, my parents never fought, but it wasn't a good relationship, right? Or like
cold
they still
violence or something like that.
Yeah, passive aggressive or that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that conflict's a bad thing. Often it's about repair attempts, and can they see how a couple sorts through these issues, see how people can show up in that vulnerable in the moment instead of reactive in the moment.
It's really interesting because it's very easy to see people reacting to humiliations or anything with violence, but actually you can see a man's true value when how they deal with this thing like maturely. Meanwhile, don't lose the dignity. Meanwhile, make nobody hurt.
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Right. So at least like if nobody's hurt, that's the best. If one got to be hurt, then that should be you because you hurt my feelings.
Right.
So that's almost seems like a suboptimal solution.
Yeah.
So probably for kids, you can also, when they face those kind of situations, you can also actually start with a smaller problem and say practice expressing your feelings instead of like when you grow up, when you are 40, 50 years old, never tried this before, and now suddenly it's really hard to imagine you can react in another way, right?
Yeah, you got it.
You're just not used to it.
Yeah. And I say, and it's not just I don't want to put it all on parents either, because kids spend a lot of time outside of the home, like for a long time. I think this is sometimes feels like the bigger challenge, but what about all the other adults in that kid's life, from teachers to coaches to, the band directors to whatever they're into, those are all like mini opportunities to support, multiple ways of showing up. But if those roles, so if I look up to a coach, and this is a coach who, calls people sissies and like it does that kind of very traditional, like that's not gonna, the outcome is gonna be very different, than a coach that supports people in different ways. So,
do you think that will hurt the performance of the team?
That people, have that question a lot of the time, but there's been plenty of successful teams that have changed their culture,
really?
that used to haze, starters and rookies coming in, but they decide, we're not going to do that anymore. That's the part that I have trouble with, is this argument, like, if suddenly we're no longer humiliating people in the locker room, that's going to somehow, our competitive spirit is going to be crushed. I mean,
for example, if you think about the dream you tried it in the military, definitely this is a no-no.
Yeah.
Almost, right? Yeah, you want to bring the aggression and the worst part, actually, of the masculinity almost out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sports is kind of like in the middle ground.
Well, I think back, and I do share this example with some of my students I just did the other day. It's kind of weird. In high school, one of my sports was swimming. That was the one I probably spent my most time on. For no good reason, our high school swim team, we were worse hazers than any other team. Like we did, like people, upper class at the time, did more horrible things to freshman male swimmers than the football team did, than the wrestling team did. We shared the room with the wrestlers. When I look back on that, there was nothing that happened in the locker room, like getting wedgies or having your head shoved in the toilet. None of us went out and swam faster because of that, right? So like it wasn't like this, hey, this is really inspiring me to be more competitive. By the time I was senior and captain, we weren't gonna do stuff that way. We were just as good, if not better, than 4 years prior to that. So it wasn't the hazing itself.
Where did the thing start even?
Oh, who knows? It could have been going for decades.
Several decades ago or something. Some people just decided to go that way and that thing just passed along.
I know, I don't get the hate. Well, so some people have argued that culturally, because we don't have the markers of manhood that like indigenous cultures used to have, where you might go off on a quest or a vision quest, or you might go on a hunt, that there were these very clear ways of kind of marking when I've moved from boyhood into adulthood, that some of these rituals that these all-male groups like fraternities, sports teams have done are like a bastardization.
It's a projection of
these. Yeah, right, yeah. I don't know. But I'll share something interesting just socially from that experience. I remember, so these were some of these guys I swam with when I was like 6, right? So in a summer league. So they were several years older than I was, but I knew them. I had known them for 10 years before or not 10, I guess. But anyway, before I got into high school. So they were seniors, responsible for doling out the wedgies, lifting people up. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of them pulling me aside before it was going to happen, that swim practice. And he said, I just want to let you know, everybody, all the freshmen are going to get wedgies. My advice to you is don't say a word. Don't scream, don't cry, don't do anything. Just take it, and it will be over quickly. And I got that mentorship, and it was the best advice I ever got, because I got lifted up. That's boring. I wasn't squirming, I wasn't screaming, put me down, and I was never hazed again. There were a couple boys in my class that reacted emotionally and then were picked on for the next 2-3 years.
Forever, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I look back, it's sad, right, like to think about that. And I was grateful for getting that advice. And that's one where, wow, emotional stoicism paid off in that environment. Like it was adaptive in that environment. But did it have to be there in the first place? Like, go back to what impact does it have on the team? Well, I probably certainly felt a lot more solidarity with the team as a whole than a couple of the guys that over the years were getting picked on. I don't see that as how it was helping them. It certainly wasn't helping them swim. And so I think collectively, I don't see the value in those behaviors, even if they're seen as bonding or whatever they are. If you look at the whole, I don't see that there's any net benefits, even if you may argue, oh, well, we did it because that's the way it's always been or whatever.
So also almost like the expression of aggressions, legal aggressions.
Absolutely.
Violence.
Yeah.
Which is sad. I never recall I had those kind of experiences back, but because we come from a different culture, I guess people are less violent from the beginning, and also everybody was so busy studying. All right. We don't have time for that.
Sure.
Yeah, every day from 7 to 8.
Sure.
Yeah, you just do homeworks again and again, try to study. But yeah. Well,
I spent 4 weeks in Luoyang, China, a couple years ago with UWL students, and so we were at a middle school, and it was a private boarding school. So these were like really smart kids, but they stayed there during the week and slept in dorms, and they were studying, and they'd be up at 5 something in the morning doing morning exercises, studying all day. But one thing that we all noticed, and this was very touching, we noticed how comfortable the boys were, even with physical touch, touching each other and laughing. And so they were no less happy than an adolescent in the United States. They were probably working harder than a lot of our students do, but they seemed to be happy, and they didn't seem to be as concerned with that physical affection. Yeah, and I don't know what it was about it, but we just observed it be different, because a lot of these were teacher trained, students trained to become teachers. Who's like, oh yeah, I don't see that in the middle school in lacrosse.
Yeah, girls holding hands is very common back in China.
Yeah.
And then they go shopping, they just hold hands,
Yep.
and sometimes they share ice cream.
Yep.
And they actually did the same thing when I was in my PhD, and some guy actually pulled me aside and just said, are they lesbians?
Yeah,
The first thing they just figured, I just said, no, they're just friends. This is actually how friends react to each other.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes they try each other's clothes, and it's totally fine for them, yeah.
So and that's an example in kind of U.S. masculinity that we often over-sexualize or hyper-sexualize things.
Or individualism, I would say.
That may be
because in China, I don't know how hard it is for you to imagine, when I was a kid, we have those kind of public restrooms, and basically people just face each other.
Yeah.
We don't have a isolated room with gates or anything. You just see each other all the time.
Yeah.
So a lot of things you need to share.
Yeah.
Because you have to.
Right.
Simply, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays people are getting more individualized. They have their own space. They learn to actually respect each other's space and everything. But still, those kind of culture kind of carries through.
Yeah.
And also your brothers, they touch you, no problem. Your father touching you, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like how our culture works.
Yeah.
So, and I don't see anything wrong with it. And I think people help each other more once they have those kind of physical, how to say, you don't do that thing with random people, of course.
Right.
It's almost like we're brothers with different family names. That's kind of how we put it.
Gotcha.
It's like, if you really want to make a brother, you can make a brother with any random guy. Just like, I think, I like talking with you. Yeah. And we're kind of like brothers now. And it's actually sometimes a big commitment. Just like if you die today, I'm going to take care of your family.
Gotcha.
That's as big as that compared to what I see here. I found, wow, that's actually very, very different. When people say they are friends with you, that means a totally different thing. Okay. Because it's a pretty serious commitment if you say that.
So that's a beautiful example of cross-cultural differences in gendered friendships, right? So to say that it's masculine to, only go out and just talk surface level sports and maybe just get drunk together but not know that this human being is suffering, right next to me. Again, there's nothing inherently masculine about that, right?
Yeah, for me,
it's cultured.
Yeah, for me, I see everything I see from there. The first time I came here, I'm not familiar with the culture. I just see stupidity. I'm just going to be fair.
Yeah.
Like, why do you want to get wasted?
Yeah.
Very often, and you work hard to earn a lot of, like, you're a student, right? You earn, you work hard to earn some money, and you spend nothing on alcohol, which is like strange to me. While you have debts to pay, and you think that's cool.
Yeah.
That's the first time I saw that. I just like, wow, this doesn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can shed a little light on some of it. And this is the joke I tell when people say, "Oh, no, you know, men don't say they love each other to each other." I said, "Yeah, they do. Go to the bar at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
You'll see plenty of guys with their arms around each other saying, 'I love you.'" And so I think so if we're not giving men opportunities to do that, right, with each other, and and it not be judged and weird and get homophobic and all that kind of stuff, it's like, well, as soon as their inhibitions are impaired a little, let down a little bit, now they've got some flexibility and freedom to do it.
So it's almost like you're creating a social situation for you to express some feelings.
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I got people talk with me and suspect that's actually the thing.
Yeah. I think so. Now, then the devastating part is if you continue that disinhibition, that's also then when we see a lot of those other behaviors, poor choices, sexual aggression, drunk driving, like stuff where people are harming self and others.
Because from the beginning, that is not a too healthy situation to begin with, right?
Right.
So yeah,
right.
Interesting. What about? I found another thing interesting here. That is, I don't know how you feel about this. It's hard to share a deep. It's almost like people respect your boundary. So I don't want to know anything personal. If you say something personal, people are going to say, "Hey, I'm going to back off. Don't tell me that." Things like that. In our culture, it's actually that's almost like a sign. Like, I'm sharing this with you, so from now on we can share everything about information. So is that also like a masculinity thing?
In my experience, I think that's the challenge to vulnerability, right? So it's like, and yet I want to be clear too, because I don't think there are a lot of boys and men walking around out there without feelings, right? I don't believe it to be true at all. But when in interviews, when on the research on male friendships, you'll often hear them. So men get caught up in these concepts in social psych, like called false consensus or pluralistic ignorance. So this idea, and they're similar, but they operate in different directions. So it might be, I think I'm in the minority, when in fact I'm in the majority. So if I'm a group of 6 guys, and maybe I am hurting in some way. Let's just say, like, I really want to tell these guys, let's say I had a breakup, and I just need them to listen to me and say, "Wow, that really sucks." But they're all saying, "Oh, go hook up with somebody else or just deal with it, be better." There might be 4 other guys in that circle who are thinking the exact same thing as me. Boy, I really wish I could just say this and be supported. But no other guys are thinking that, and so I have to say what I think everybody else is thinking and saying.
Interesting.
And so a lot of guys collude together in not connecting more deeply because they're afraid that nobody else feels that way.
It will make you less a man.
Yeah, and when in fact they might be. I'll give you, here's my self-disclosure, here's a story I tell a lot about that. So in the U.S., oftentimes with bachelor parties, kind of the historical norm was you go out to a strip club, right, and see, exotic dancing or something. I did not want to do that. So that was something that was not part of my family upbringing. And I actually remember very explicitly my father was in sales for a time, and he, when if he was out on a trip with other salesmen, it'd be Friday, they'd be done, and they'd be like, "Hey, let's go to the strip club." And my dad wouldn't do it. Like, that was just not something that, it was not appropriate. He didn't want to do that. And I remember him saying that. So it was in the back of my head. So when we were planning my bachelor party, I thought, all right, how can I situate this so I can avoid going to a strip club? So I said, we'll do a bachelor party on a houseboat. Because I know nothing about houseboats. Other than if we're on water, how can we go to a strip club? And so, again, showing I know nothing about houseboats, you have to dock a houseboat at night. So you can't be on the river. So we were on the Illinois River. These were like 13, 14 friends of mine from high school and college, all together in the strip club. And a couple of guys were like, "Let's go to the strip club." And I was like, "No, I don't want to." And they're like, you don't have a choice. And I was like, but isn't this my bachelor party? They're like, no, this is what we do. And so there's all this person. So of course we all go to the strip club. And me and like one other person, kind of hung off on the side, like kind of, not caring too much, having beers, talking to each other, but trying to kind of minimize. But had a fun time overall, went home. A couple years later, another person's bachelor party. Let's go to the strip club. And it's like, I don't really want to go. And people are like, I don't know if I want to go either, but we'll just go anyway. And I say, don't ruin the fun. So now we're at another one, but there are more people at my table than before that didn't want to go either. So then, this is to show I'm a slow learner. So now third bachelor party. I think we're in Vegas at the time. Let's go to the strip club. And a bunch of us were like, no. Not interested. Now, at this point, what has changed is we had our first daughter, and I was in graduate school doing clinical work, and I had some clients that were dancers. And I was like, you know what? I'm not comfortable with it. I don't want to support this. This is just not who I am. I don't want my daughter to grow up in a world this is an occupation for. And a lot of them said, me neither. So of that group of 14, 2 of them got an Uber and went anyway, and then they meet up with us later. So this whole time, this is like about the same group of friends, all 3 years, or all 3 parties, most of the guys didn't really want to go. But we all just like, oh yeah, that's what you do. Or I don't want to be the one person who spoils the fun and stays home. And yet we were all colluding in silence for several years until we all discovered, right? And like, I look back on it, kind of say, look, I'm not like the hero here, right? It took me several times to actually just speak up more honestly about it. But just to also highlight that social pressure guys sometimes feel, and then and they don't challenge, they don't stand up, they don't challenge a norm, even though it's not a real norm. It is this mythical perceived norm that everybody feels this way, and yet they don't. So that's the part I think about masculinity that I find that I get, I understand it, I've lived it, but I also think is one of the most challenging components. It's that social norming piece, and saying like, what is it that men do here, and if I violate that, what's it going to cost me?
It still sounds like a byproduct of the ritual we inherited from the tribe.
Yeah,
Voodoo totem and
absolutely.
everything. Just like, like it or not, this is almost like without this, you will never be a man.
Right.
But for now, like in this modern society, with all the freedom, is it really necessary to carve your arm or just chop off one of the finger, put your blood into something? I would say if you do that, that would be impressive.
Yeah.
Compared to just getting drunk.
Right.
Like I can't say enough about my hearing students just say, hey, I'm totally prepared to get wasted on my 21st birthday. It's just like, why?
Mm-hmm.
You are not this kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
But I do it either way. So yeah, that's strange. Going back to the guy who actually break up with his girlfriend on that day, right? Maybe if you bring it up and everybody's okay with that, seems like, oh, maybe I'm the one which is not competent. Right. But it turns out actually everybody's just as vulnerable, as weak as you, and sometimes it's actually sharing those kind of feelings will actually be good for the whole group, not just for yourself, right?
Yeah.
And it's really hard to tough out, constantly.
And I think maybe here's part of the link. So, and this is like if we're gendering things at the extreme, and so part of the hallmark of what people are calling toxic masculinity, or I call it like restrictive masculinity or reactive masculinity. If we're saying if a boy hears his entire life, emotions are girly, you're a sissy, you're a pussy, whatever, right? Like if they're hearing that over again, like this anti-femininity over and over again, no wonder they're gonna sit back and say, oh, maybe I shouldn't share this, because if I do, I will be seen as a girl, a woman, whatever, and that's the worst thing that I could be seen as. So if we're sending that messages, so no wonder guys are sitting there being like, I'm not going to speak up. I'm not going to test this, because the threat feels so great of social, being outcast, whatever.
People are going to make fun of me and everything, but if you think about it, that is kind of something which happened back when they have a lot of manufactured jobs and people are uneducated.
Yeah.
That's more something you're going to probably need to really think about. But for nowadays, people are so educated. People have seen so much, and everybody knows how to respect each other. Actually, probably stopping nothing won't be a bad thing because it make you uncomfortable, right?
Right.
So,
and often boys and men focus on the cost but not the benefits. And so the default is, what's this going to cost me in the short term or maybe long term? But we're not also pausing to say, well, okay, but what are the benefits? And if I run this algorithm through, like, yeah, you know what? Right now they might give me some shit and they might call me some names, but maybe it will start a conversation and maybe this friendship will grow and I'll have somebody I can really
you set the frame how you want to be with other people, right? Sometimes I think about this too, because some people say I'm blunt. I would say, yeah, great. Now you know I'm blunt. From now on until the end of the day, think about how you speak to me. Right? So actually I deal with the hard feelings for one time. Now I'm all set for the rest of my life. It's the same thing with you. Like if you just stand up and say, hey, I don't want to go to the strip club, from now on you'll be exempt from all the strip club invitation from the rest of your life. For me, I think about that. It's just like there's no better benefits, whatever it costs. I'm going to do it because I'm good for the rest of my life. So it's funny you mentioned this because this is something I've been struggling with this last summer. I've been kind of coming to terms with this idea, and part of it's cultural here. We call it Midwest nice, and I don't know if you've thought much about that. Well, I have California nice, Alabama nice, and then Midwest nice. So I know 3 different nices.
All right. So, and you know, some people say, well, this is an extreme form of passive aggressive, or you know, it shows up as passive aggressive in the extreme. But I've been trying to think about the difference between nice and kind, and so, and I think this actually goes back. We'll use the strip club example. In that moment, I thought I was being nice by not rocking the boat. You know, not wanting to ruin your fun, right? So I'm going to be nice, and I'm going to take the hit here. I'm going to be nice and let you have your fun, right? To me, that registered as a nice thing to do in that moment. The problem with nice is that in that situation, I gave up a part of myself, right? And if I can,
the boundary.
And if I continue to do that, it's going to cost me. I might build up resentment to those friends. I might build up resentment to myself for not, you know. The kind thing to do in that moment would have been, and I think for me, when I heard blunt, that's why I'm thinking of kindness. Like, it would have been kind. Maybe it would have hurt in that moment. And they would be like, no, but I really wanted to hang out tonight. I really want to spend time with you this way. And I'm frustrated. But ultimately, that would have been the kind thing to do, because in the long run, that would have prevented me from feeling resentful, and then other people.
That's exactly, because every time you give people a reaction, they will actually go into shape their behaviors towards your reaction. If you're nice this time, they're going to expect you to be nice next time. Then next time, whenever they make that decision, just say, don't ask Ryan, because he's okay with everything. Yeah,
that is you just gave a perfect...
Right, and a lot of people don't realize that, because for me, just personal opinion, I think saying the truth is always the best way to solve it, because number one, if you say the wrong thing one time, it's not just that one time. You start to pay interest of it.
Oh, that's what I look at.
Right? It's not like, okay, it's just one harm. No. Next time, 10%. Next time, 10%. And I constantly reflect. You know, the first time we went out, I said that. I still remember that thing, and you guys hurt my feelings. That's number one. Number two is sometimes you have those kind of resentfulness simply because you didn't communicate to other people, and you have no idea. Maybe they will respect that.
Right.
You actually you didn't give other people an opportunity to accommodate to your needs. But then automatically you think they're bad people because they don't care about my feelings. But how am I supposed to care your feelings if you say, I want to go too, or I'm okay with it? I just say, wow, I just gave Orion an opportunity. He has never been there before. I'm doing a good thing. Compared to, I'm actually hurting him simply because he doesn't want to go.
Right.
Communicate clearly will actually solve that problem. Other people you will actually start to see other people are actually way more friendly than you think. They are going to actually care about your feelings as long as you say it, though.
Right. Oh, I love it.
But then, if you think about this thing, one thing I observe actually is in the marriage. Just so many times you see people just, I came home late, but I'm a good wife. I'm not going to say a thing. One time, twice. Third times I figured, wow, you're so late. And suddenly, I came home, and my wife gave me a cold meal. How do you know? She did it on purpose, simply because I hate you. So I will find all these kind of small things to hurt you without breaking the thing, right? And then the guy just say, well, I'm a good husband. I shouldn't complain anything. Right. But then I'll come home more late. So you have those kind of things building up until one day you start to see like, okay, why is my meal cold? You finally ask, and then the moment that one of them just smashed the dish, I've been suffering for a long time. And then I don't know where this comes from. Like, why don't you tell me?
Yeah.
Right? So after 10 years, until that moment, you start to feel like there's no way you can repair this relationship.
Yeah.
And it's all about the interest you keep paying, which is, I would like to use it's a compound interest.
I love that model.
Right? You pay that. Exponential growth.
Yeah.
So done.
So you've also done this very great job of talking about, they call it the violence pyramid. So when we talk about violence broadly, but we'll talk about men's violence specifically, at the base of the pyramid are it's all the little things that people get away with that go unchallenged. So they might make a racist joke, they might make a sexist joke, they might do any of these number of things. And it's just like you said, if I let it pass, if I say, oh well, I don't want to hurt your feelings, I'm going to laugh at your joke, your sexist joke, right? These guys in this case are finding all these situations where they're not getting challenged, and then they start to increase, push the boundaries, and now they're in a state where they're perpetrating violence against another human being. But it all rests on that bed of kind of colluding in silence and not being honest and not being forthright about stuff. And so I think a lot of men's behavior, I think that's how we sometimes see those extremes, is because they've been testing the boundaries, and they haven't been challenged. And then meanwhile, guys are, shorting themselves by participating, but then saying I'm a nice guy, like I wouldn't do that, like I wouldn't hit another woman, but I'm laughing at that guy's jokes, or I'm supporting him in some other way. So I guess a real man, but a real human, if you want to take responsibility, if you want to stand up, if you want to show assertiveness, that's an opportunity to do it.
Yeah, when people know your boundary, they will actually accommodate to that boundary and know, okay, don't piss him off on this.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel like it creates a better environment for you. Mm. It also creates a better environment for other people too, which is because they know totally you're predictable.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as I stay away from that, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Right. So that's actually, I kind of feel like especially for between males, it's like we're constantly pushing boundaries.
Yeah. We're testing
and try to see like where we should go, and that's how we establish almost every relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't want to be taken advantage of, and you want this relationship to be healthy, not one-sided, probably you just need to take that step.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of masculinity too. That's called brave. For me, that's called braveness.
Yep. Yeah. And what comes with braveness is vulnerability. So that's the part. So sometimes people think about courage and braveness as only the part that we see on the surface, like the outcome of the bravery.
Yeah.
But to even put yourself in a position, like to do that brave thing, whatever that might be, whether it's some physical feat or an emotional one, that requires putting yourself in a vulnerable position. Those things go hand in hand, but we often, I think, as males particularly, will focus on the brave part without paying attention to the vulnerability that had to occur to be brave in the first place. And I think there's multiple ways to be brave.
That's interesting, because I would just try to associate with. I just finished a cartoon, and basically, what makes you a true warrior is not how good you are at fighting, but what you fight for.
Oh, yeah.
You need something to fight for. You need something, like your bravery should be based on something you're fighting for. Otherwise, it's just not brave.
No,
that's just reckless. Right?
Right, there you go. Yeah, there's a big difference. And I think I shouldn't say a lot, but at the extreme ends, a lot of that masculine bravery is recklessness. It's not supported or backed up by some of these other, I guess, more noble approaches to things.
Interesting. Well, we hit the mark of. Every time I talk with you, I feel like every time we go easily on 100 minutes. So I would call it for today.
That's fair. Yeah.
And
otherwise I'll go on
we can talk
forever.
later. On something else. But thank you for joining us today.
So I love that you do this, and I've been listening to other people's and watching. It's awesome.
Great.
It's
Thanks.
a great thing for the community, and thanks for having me.